Welcome to History 111, Lecture 40, Home Fronts. Now, the war is going to have some serious long-term consequences for northern industry. Labor shortages are going to lead to mechanization of agriculture and to a reduction in the number of people needed in that workforce. There's also going to be a mass expansion of coal production to fuel all this rail transport. And during the course of the war, the North is going to be able to finally finish standardizing the rail gauge. Now, rail gauge is the distance between the two rails, and what that allows when it's standardized is for trains to continue down basically any track they want. Because when trains encounter a track of a different gauge, they can only do one of two things with their cargo. They can either go ahead and unload all the cargo from that train and then load it onto a different train on that different sized rail gauge track, or they can pick the entire train up and move the wheels. Now, both of those are major efforts, and really it's simpler just to unload it from one train to the other. Now, during the war, the North is able to get it down so there's one rail gauge being used throughout the North, and that gives them a big advantage, and that's something the South is never able to achieve. Now, within the North, though, also, we do need to realize that prices are going to rise 70% and wages are only going to rise 40%, because there's new waves of immigrants that are keeping wages low, and that's going to lead to things like significant increases in union membership. Now, also this time, we do need to realize that there's $450 million in greenbacks being issued, and with all these different factors, the greenback dollar is going to really lose value very rapidly, and by 1864, it's only worth 39 cents on the dollar. Now, there's also about $2.6 billion in loans that are going to be used to finance this war, and about $400 million are bonds being sold to the general public, so people are contributing in that way as well. Now, one of the things that happens very early on is that Lincoln realizes the war is not going to be over quickly, and Congress authorizes him to raise an army of 500,000 men for 3 years. Now, the thing is, they can't actually get that many recruits, so they have to institute the draft by 1863. And only about 46,000 people are drafted, but you can get out of the draft by paying someone to go in your place or by paying a $300 fee, and that's ultimately going to set off the worst set of riots in American history in New York City, and it's a 4-day rampage with a lot of race-based attacks on African Americans, and federal troops had to be used to restore order. Now, with all of these people, though, being pulled into the Army through voluntary recruitment and through the draft, many Northern women are going to go ahead and enter the workforce to fill various shortages there. And a lot of male-dominated professions saw significant numbers of women enter for the first time. And at this point, teachers, office work, and nursing were male-dominated. But nursing in particular is going to become a female-dominated profession by the end of the war. Now, a lot of male doctors objected and thought that women were too weak for medical work, but the needs of the war ultimately overcame that gender bias. There are also significant advances made in medicine during the war. There's a move towards more sanitary conditions, because during the war, more people died of disease than of wounds. People were dying of things like dysentery, malaria, typhoid, gangrene. These were generally brought on by wounds. For example, if you were wounded and you got shot, the treatment you received generally caused gangrene to set in, and the gangrene was what actually killed you, not the gunshot wound. Now, when we look at the South, one of the first things we should realize is the Confederate Constitution was practically the same as the Union Constitution, but there were some very important differences. States are explicitly stated to be sovereign, so states' rights is built in the Confederate Constitution, as is slavery. So that's going to make abolition basically impossible within the southern states. Now, Jefferson Davis is elected the president of the Confederate States, and he ends up with a government dominated by moderates, but realizes that most of the backcountry refuses to recognize the Confederate government and does not support them throughout the war. Now, Southern finance structure at this point was practically non-existent. They had about $1 million in gold and silver coins, and had a weak and haphazard banking system, and very little in terms of liquid assets. Now, the South is going to try to raise money by borrowing from Europe using cotton as collateral, but that's not going to work. So they end up printing huge amounts of paper money, about $1.5 billion in total. And the haphazard system of different notes from different banks and states is going to be really causing economic chaos, and prices are going to rise 9,000% during this war. And you have to think about what that really means. When something rises 9,000%, it's going to cost $1 in the first year of the war. It's going to cost 90 at the end. That's the kind of massive increase in prices we're talking about, and that's going to cause a lot of economic chaos. Now, within the South also, voluntary enlistments are going to drop after 1861, and they're going to go ahead and also institute a draft. Initially, they're going to go ahead and offer exemptions for those who could supply a replacement, and they also exempted one male per plantation with more than 20 slaves. And that's going to lead to claims that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. But the South is going to ultimately rely on conscription, but still never have enough men. Now, as the Union is going to capture and isolate territory, that's going to cut off the Confederate Army from replacement soldiers, and they're going to have to up the draft age to 50. And they even started to consider arming slaves, but the war ended before they could actually go ahead and try that. Now, the South is often divided by states' rights, and that hamstrings their ability to organize their war effort. Now, they are going to take some steps like nationalizing the railway industry and so on, but economic chaos is pretty much the rule of the day. The war is going to destroy a lot of productive land, and most of the war is being fought in the South. There's also a naval blockade that's limiting the southern export industry and going to cause widespread shortages due to limited industry there. Now, like in the North, women in the South are going to take over a lot of roles while men are at war. A lot are going to enter occupations, others are going to start managing plantations. Now, many slaves are also going to be attempting to escape whenever a Union army approached, and those far from the front are going to take advantage of the situation and engage in increased passive resistance to undermine production and further hinder the war effort. So, in other words, there's a lot of factors working against the South. So what's the big idea? Well, throughout the course of the war, northern industry ultimately improves, where in the south it ultimately comes down to economic chaos. Now, some things that are common on both sides are that women enter many occupations, and in particular, nursing becomes a female-dominated occupation even down to today as a result of this. Now, in both sides, they use the draft, but that never supplies enough men, and there's a resistance to it, especially in the north. Now, both sides are going to see inflation and price increases, but in the South, those are going to be completely out of control and really further expand that economic chaos we mentioned a minute ago. See you in the next lecture.